In 2023, the Singapore Civil Defence Force received an average of 676 emergency calls a day. But out of these, 32 turned out to be non-emergency.
Emergency, how can I help you?
So what's the big deal, you ask? Consider this. An ambulance crew typically takes 5 to 7 calls every shift.
Work in the 32 non-emergency calls. That means taking away 4 to 5 ambulances every day from tending to real emergencies.
So in this episode of Talking Point, I want to find out, why are we still calling 995 for non-emergencies?
%80 of emergency calls received by the Singapore Civil Defence Force, or SCDF, relate to medical conditions such as chest pains, breathlessness, and cardiac arrests.
In a cardiac arrest, blood has stopped flowing to the heart, to the brain, to all your vital organs. So every minute counts.
Male engine 60, phase of collapse.
Your chances of survival decreases by 10% for every minute that you actually waste in seeking treatment. In the first minute, there is some oxygen still in the blood, but because the blood supply has stopped to the brain, between the first to the 4th minute, your brain cells will start to die, which means by 10 minutes, there's an extremely high chance that you will be dead. Or you might end up being in a permanent vegetative state or a comatose state. The same thing applies for a stroke or a heart attack. Every minute that you waste in seeking treatment, you are increasing your chances of living with a disability.
Why is it critical for 995s to be reserved for these cases?
So firstly, before they arrive, they can also activate us to let us know that a patient with a stroke or heart attack or cardiac arrest or trauma is arriving in the emergency department. Secondly, the ambulance is not just a form of transport. 995 paramedics can initiate treatment on the ambulance itself and hand them over to the emergency department to continue treatment.
If I were to call 995 and I go into the A&E and someone else has the same condition as me and they came by a private means, do I get priority for treatment?
No. So if it's not an emergency, even if you call 995, you will not get priority treatment.
In 2023, the SCDF introduced a non-dispatch policy where it can refuse to send out ambulances.
Yet, they have only refused to send ambulances for 3 cases that have been deemed to be non-emergencies. So why are ambulances still being sent for non-emergency?
I am meeting with Dr. Benjamin Leong.
Now, if you feel any pain is getting worse, let us know.
He sits on the Medical Advisory Committee of the SCDF.
When someone calls 995, what's the triaging process like?
Triaging is the process of sorting the severity or urgency of any patient, and we practice that every day in the A&E. On a call, there are some other different priorities. The first thing that we want to know is where is the location of the emergency. Just in case you stop talking halfway through the call, I know where to send the help to. That aside, what we would like to do in a call is to try to identify the most urgent, most serious conditions right at the front after you pass those filters, and then we address the slightly less urgent conditions later on.
And if the triaging process works, why are ambulances still being sent out for a non-emergency case?
Imagine this, you come to a hospital, a doctor takes a history from you, meaning asking questions about your condition, performs a physical examination, runs tests. That all takes time that a call center does not have. They have to quickly make a decision within 2 to 3 minutes or less and rapidly dispatch out the ambulance as fast as they can. Some amount of over-triage, if you will, needs to be accepted. Under-triage, meaning failing to recognize the serious condition, we try to minimize so that we send out the ambulances to the patient as soon as possible.
So it's better to be safe than sorry?
In a way, yes.
Where it might be difficult for the emergency call center to assess if it's a real emergency or not, maybe the owners should sit with us.
I have statements here describing various medical conditions that people have called 9954, but not everything here is an emergency. Now, I want to find out if we can tell the difference. Here are the set of cards.
Right.
Now you have to decide which of them are emergencies and which are non-emergencies.
All right. Not entirely sure about this.
So burns and breathlessness, we're not sure.
Because sometimes you might just get a tiny burn, but if it's a big burn, it does sound more like an emergency.
Vomiting, maybe emergency. A headache, it could be an emergency.
How did you go about making this decision?
From personal experiences with my family, basically. When whatever happens, the person, gets kind of incapacitated or can't move or can't, get up from the bed.
Right. For electric shock.
I mean, I don't know. I would say maybe middle. Yeah. Middle.
Chronic pain is might be emergency.
Vomiting.
Vomiting. Well, I had food poisoning before I didn't have to go to the hospital.
This one definitely, yes. Electric shock.
So non-emergency.
Sorry.
Emergency.
Yeah, I'm
Okay.
just confused.
How serious is the burn?
It's a burn.
It's tricky, Like sometimes when you're stressed, you suddenly get chest pain.
Fractures, non-emergency.
Hannah, you seem to disagree with a few of them. Are there any
Yeah.
ones you disagree with?
If you get a fracture like at school, then it's an emergency. But if it's at home, then I guess you can just go to the clinic.
Okay, thank you so much. Now here's a summary of all the responses. These 4 conditions we are the most confused about. So burns, fractures, fall from a flight of stairs, choking. All of these here we tend to consider non-emergencies, so no need to call the ambulance. And these we tend to consider emergencies. So people are definitely calling the ambulance here. Now the question is, are we correct?
After gathering responses from members of the public about what they think is an emergency and isn't, I want to know if we are correct. I'm getting answers from someone who spends over 50 hours a week dealing with emergencies across 3 A&Es.
This is a summary of all the results that we got. Now, the 4 conditions in the middle are the ones that people were most confused about, whether to put them in a non-emergency or under emergency, because I think they felt there were a lot of variables, but everything else was quite unanimous. How did we do?
All these conditions, not just the 4 in the center, they're all very subjective and it depends on each individual. For example, a choking episode, if it was just a temporary period of choking and now the patient is completely fine, he's talking to you, he's breathing normally, then it would be a non-emergency. But if the choking is persisting, the patient is still grasping their neck, still can't breathe, then it is an emergency.
Are there conditions that, without a doubt, you should call an ambulance for?
Cardiac arrest or collapse, heart attacks, and strokes. These are clear-cut conditions. They are time-sensitive. They need to be addressed quickly, and I'll treat them as emergencies.
Doctor, I'm going to give you a little challenge. For the 4 conditions that we were most confused about, how would you categorize them if you had to?
I think it's a real challenge for me too, because all 4 of these conditions, they all lie in a spectrum. They could be minor and they could be very serious. But by and large, burns would usually be minor. If you've scalded your hand on a pot and pan, I would then move this to here, right? But if I was involved in a house fire and I've got multiple parts of my body involved with burns, then this now becomes here. But by and large in Singapore, a lot of our burns tend to be minor and they tend to end up here. As for fractures, again, lies in a spectrum. If you just had a pain in your leg, you've fallen down and you can't walk now, but there's no bleeding, there's no numbness, in that situation it would lie under non-emergency. But let's say your fracture is so bad that the bone is sticking out of your leg, there's bleeding coming out, you can't feel your leg below, that means nerves are injured, that now becomes an emergency. And then you'd end up under the emergency section.
So when it comes to these rather ambiguous ones, how do I as a layman decide, oh, this is an emergency at this moment and I should call the ambulance?
If you as a layperson think about your condition and how you incurred that injury. And you know, I'm on these blood thinners. My doctors told me if I fall down, I have to be very careful. And I fell down 4 flights of stairs, and now I lost consciousness for 10 minutes. I'm very worried. I would then put myself under an emergency. Ask yourself a very simple question. Is the condition you're having at the moment something that will potentially cause something life-threatening to yourself or lead to a permanent disability? If the answer to that question is yes, then I would say treat it as an emergency and go down to the A&E.
Should people still err on the side of caution and call an ambulance?
You see, that's a chicken and egg problem, right? Err on the side of caution, everybody calls ambulance, then the emergency services get clogged up, and that leads to long waiting times to people who actually need ambulances. Whereas if nobody calls an ambulance when it's required, then people get delayed treatment when they should have been seen earlier. So in those situations where it's difficult to ambulate around and get yourself to the hospital and you want an ambulance, there are non-emergency ambulance services available, such as a 1-777 they can call, and they will get a non-emergency ambulance to you to assist in transporting you to the hospital.
1-777. Heard of it? This hotline was set up way back in 1998 with a network of over 40 private ambulance operators. Instead of your call going to the SCDF, it goes to the 1-777 call center, whose operator will determine the type of help needed and disseminate the case to a panel of private ambulance operators. But unlike 995 emergency ambulances, this service is chargeable.
But a quick search for 1-777 showed this. Don't call 1-777. This non-emergency hotline is really a joke. You mean 1-777? Don't. It's expensive and waiting time is 45 minutes to an hour. The price, $210, and if you need oxygen, you have to top up $50. 1-777 must pay so much to use. Call Grab is better.
I've arranged to meet one of the oldest private ambulance companies who is also on the 1-777 panel to see if there's another side to the story.
I've been looking online, and one of the biggest complaints people have is that 1-777 can be considerably expensive. Why is that?
Prices from various private ambulance companies typically ranges from $90 to $260 and at max $300. But of course, this would differ from company to company. Now, if you were to compare, when you call 995 for a non-emergency conveyance, you may be subjected to a fees of $274. And that is comparable to what the private ambulance companies are charging.
995 is free for real emergencies. But if you call the hotline for a non-emergency, you'd have to pay for the service.
For 1-777, do I have to pay for everything that's used on board?
Every company has its own price structure. Some would charge for the consumables, for the procedures that are done on board. But for us, we only charge for the usage of oxygen, as well as if the AED pads are used in a case of cardiac arrest. All the other consumables like gauze, plasters, bandages, we do not charge.
Can I choose which hospital to go to? Because I know when you call 995, they take you to the nearest hospital.
Yes, you can choose the hospital of your choice to be conveyed to. But in the event there is an emergency that occurs en route, you suddenly become ill and you require immediate attention, life-threatening situation like cardiac arrest, then the ambulance will detour and send the patient to the nearest hospital, the nearest A&E.
So when I call 1-777, what can I expect to be different?
When you call 995, you will definitely get an emergency response ambulance that comes with 3 men. It is meant for real emergencies: cardiac arrest, stroke, fall from heights, bleeding, drowning, burns, severe burns. Whereas for private ambulance, we are only required to have 2-man team. And because it's non-emergency in nature, there are 2 services. One is MTS and one is EAS, Medical Transport Service, and Emergency Ambulance Services. Medical Transport Service meant by 2-man team, 1 driver who has basic cardiac life support and standard first aid. And EMT means Emergency Medical Technicians. They are able to handle sprained ankle, minor finger fractures, or convey to medical appointment. For emergency ambulance services, it comprises of a driver with the same qualification and the paramedic. A paramedic has more extensive knowledge because he or she has 3 years experience to deal with drugs. He can set the IV drip, So depending on your condition, the operator will try to triage and they will assign the respective ambulance to you.
So are you saying that when I call 995, I will get an emergency ambulance? But with 1777, there are two different types. There's the MTS, which is a medical transport, but there's also an emergency ambulance. So it could be either way.
Yes.
So even within your fleet, you have different ambulances?
Yes, that's correct. So this is a EAS ambulance. This machine can do a 3 to 12 lead ECG on the patient. If the patient is suspected to have some cardiac issues. Paramedic will hold this drug pouch. So inside there are drugs, IV, for emergency, for resuscitation. If the patient's heart stops and things like that, he has to give this.
Might the 995 ambulance have some things that are not here?
Yes, there are some equipments that are not available. SCDF ambulances has the Lucas. We happen to hold that. SCDF, they are always prepared for maternity cases, so they are able to do delivery. For the private setting, some ambulances can and some cannot. These are optional expertise.
So if I call a 1777, I might get an MTS and that may not have all of this?
Yes.
One great thing about calling 1777 is that I can choose the destination I want to be sent to. I could live in Jurong and choose to be sent to Tan Tock Seng Hospital for a medical appointment, and that's completely fine. So for non-emergencies, this seems to be a viable option, especially when we're sure that our conditions won't get worse on board. But if we're not sure, it seems only natural that most of us would still prefer to call 995.
And if that continues, will we be able to meet the rising demands on our ambulance services? Singapore's population of 6 million people is served by a fleet of about 90 emergency ambulances. That's one ambulance to every 66,666 persons. Compare it with other built-up cities in Asia. Hong Kong has one ambulance to every 15,658 persons. Taipei, one ambulance to 13,413 persons. And Tokyo, one ambulance to 37,568 persons. Do we need more ambulances? I'm speaking with Professor Marcus Ong, who has published over 200 papers on pre-hospital emergency care.
It is not just the absolute number of ambulances which is important, but also the way that we deploy our ambulances. And in Singapore, we use what we call a smart strategy. For example, during the day, we would have actually more ambulances rather than at night when the demand is lower. In addition, we have other initiatives like we will actually send, for example, a fire biker who is a firefighter on a motorcycle. In cases that, for example, we suspect is a cardiac arrest, the fire biker can actually zoom through the traffic and actually apply an automated external defibrillator.
With an aging population and the demands for manpower, is that a challenge that you foresee that we might have to really deal with?
So absolutely, manpower is one of our biggest challenges moving ahead in an aging society. But I think the important thing to understand is that as a country, we need to continue to invest in world-class emergency services. And that means not just the quantity or number of ambulances, but also the quality of our staff and our services and being able to deploy technology to be able to improve our efficiency.
So Prof, what I'm hearing is that instead of just focusing on increasing capacity, we're trying to deal with the situation in a more holistic manner.
Absolutely. The reality is that we can't just keep buying more ambulances, hiring more paramedics, building more hospitals, because there are constraints with any society and Singapore is not exempted from this.
If simply buying more ambulances isn't the answer, and it's a tough call to make on what really is an emergency when one is in panic mode, then perhaps the answer is in freeing up the resources of the SCDF call center.
Hi, Lee from NurseFirst. How may I help you? Okay, you are having eye pain.
NurseFirst is a free helpline launched in 2022, manned by trained triage nurses.
My advice for you is not to drive.
So instead of calling 995, you could call this number when you are unsure of your situation.
The purpose of NurseFirst is to try to divert patients from calling 995 and inundating our emergency service, because not all conditions require a 995 or emergency service. Some of the questions will help to establish the acuity of the caller's condition and help us to make a decision on where we should dispose the callers to. So we will be asking questions related to like potential red flag symptoms, their past medical history, and also some of the information that can be easily elicited by the caller at home, for example, their temperature.
And how long is each call?
Each call is roughly about 6 to 8 minutes. However, there are cases where calls can end up taking a bit longer for a bit more complex cases.
So is it possible that 6 to 8 minutes is taken away from the time it takes for someone to receive help? Could something go wrong?
So for such calls that we determine that, they really need to be called 995, we will just directly dispose them to call 995 themselves. However, if they are unable to call 995, we will call on their behalf and also inform the caller of any symptoms that they should be monitoring while the help arrives.
So what you're saying is by asking all of these questions, some of the calls that might have gone to a 995, you can redivert them?
Yes, correct.
Calling 995 and heading to an A&E might be deeply ingrained in us when we need medical attention. But it's not too late to learn a new process.
If you witness a serious road traffic accident, heart attack, loss of consciousness, excessive bleeding, or stroke, definitely call 995 for an emergency ambulance. If you require an ambulance for non-emergencies like sprains, mild fevers, superficial burns, rashes, chronic aches, or medical follow-ups, 1777 is an option. But for the ones we aren't sure of, calling NurseFirst could help us decide our next steps better.
Yes, we may have to remember a few more numbers, but hey, if we can keep our emergency resources free for those who need life-saving, urgent medical care, what's a few more numbers, right? Remember, only call 995 if it's truly an emergency.